Running Sentences presents The Madhouse Job, Part 3. A ghost? Jasper can't shake the feeling of being followed or chased by something from an ethereal side. Be it a ghost or something else, it is a lot for his mind to take in as he tries to get a firm footing to deal with all of the matters that are happening around him. This is a work of fiction. Any names, characters, businesses, events, and incidences within this story are products of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to real people, living, dead, real events, or incidences is purely coincidental. Copyright 2021, Michael Honore. All rights reserved. After dinner at the diner, Jasper and Johanna had left the establishment and were in the parking lot, getting into his car. As the two settled in, Jasper was adjusting his rearview mirror and stopped and then spun about. "What is it?" "I just swear I saw that man that was in the booth sitting in the back of my car." She looked backwards to see an empty seat. "This place is driving me crazy." "Don't joke. I've seen it happen and it isn't a funny matter. This place feels like it's out to get me, so it's fair game." "It's okay. Let's go to a nearby motel and get some rest. It's been a long few days for you. And it's a new job. It can all be very stressful and warp your mind a little bit, and just hurt your mind as you try and process everything. So let's just take a second." He sighed and looked backwards at his back seat, just to make sure that if there was anything there, or not. But since there was nothing, he groped for his car starter so that he could get the car going, and headed down the road. However, he found himself keeping his eyes on the rearview mirror just in case, throwing glances every so often to see what would happen. Down the road a few more miles, Jasper found the motel that Johanna had said was there, and it looked like a rather nice and run-down sort of location. His mind was revolting against any ideas that it put forward, so he was sure in the morning he would be horrified to see where he stayed at when he came out of the rooms. Instead, when he and Johanna got out of the car, they made their way to the front office to check in, with the hopes that they would have some rooms, and that they would be nice. Though, judging from the mostly empty parking lot, it shouldn't have been much trouble. The plan for 2 rooms, however, had gone badly as Jasper sat down heavily on the bed of the room they had rented. The exterior of the motel had a nice look to it, because it was under renovations, and which was great, except for that most of the rooms were closed because of said renovation, though the motel did have a single room with a single large bed, on which the other side sat Johanna. They looked across at one another, trying to figure out what to do about this situation. "I can go sleep in the car. We're both adults. There's no need to sleep out in the cold. The bed is big enough for 2 people. "Yes, but I have a habit of moving about and around, and occasionally nightmares. You don't want either of those things hitting you in the middle of the night." "Mr. Hughes, this is not the time, and I can deal with those things on my own. Besides, would you leave a young woman alone in a motel when strange things are happening?" "Yes, probably. What strange things, though?" "No, you would not. Besides, what if that man returns?" "Oh, the man." "Then what will you do?" "I don't know." He stood up out of frustration and began walking about the simple motel room. It was carpeted, so he couldn't stomp about, and the only other thing that were in the room aside from the bed was a couch and a desk. There was also a bathroom off in the back, but there was a door, so he didn't really fully count it as part of this room. "It's late, and we are both tired, and you would not like sleeping out there in the fog. It will probably and definitely cause you to have nightmares out there as you see figures and shadows moving about." Jasper wandered over to the window, pulling aside the curtain shade to glance outside. He was greeted by a thick wall of white, wispy fog. He let the curtain drop back down into place and looked over at the couch. "I can take the couch," He reluctantly plodded over to it without thinking much about it and sat down. Johanna, having given up slightly, had gone off to the bathroom, at least somewhat pleased that she had convinced him to stay in the room. And with this, he found himself with nothing to do, eventually laying out onto the couch, and despite not feeling very tired, he closed his eyes. When he opened his eyes, he found himself in the courtroom, where the murder trial for his family had been held. He was sat behind the prosecution table side of the court, and found himself looking right at the defendant, Port. But it wasn't right. Port should be standing and staring at the judge. Instead, he was smirking at him and staring at him, and then saying something. But the words weren't making it across to Jasper, who shook his head, and then it all faded away. He sat up with a start and found himself back in the hotel room. He blinked a few times and found himself looking at Johanna, standing there drying her hair while brushing it, in a robe and her underwear. Neither were very modest-looking things, and he found himself staring. She turned to look over at him since he'd made such a sudden movement. "You already had a nightmare?" "Yes, well, no, it was more of a reliving a memory." "Will you be alright?" I'm fine. She turned back to the mirror she was looking at to brush her hair. "Don't take an attitude with me. I was merely asking if you were okay." I'm sorry, just... it got to me. "Now, if only you would talk to me about your past and your family, we could get along very swell-like." "It sounds like you already know things about me." "I wouldn't be very much of a doctor if I didn't do research into the people I have to look after and take care of. I know the basics, and I have no interest in sharing them with others, so you will be safe with that." "Why did you do all of that? Why go through that effort with me? It doesn't seem worth it." "I need someone, and I need someone who's willing to dig into what's going on. We both want to know, and you seem like a perfect candidate, if you're willing to help me, of course. I won't force you." She finished brushing her hair and set aside the comb after looking it over for a few good seconds. With that completed, she headed over to the bed and was soon under the covers. "Are you sure that you will be okay over there? The bed is plenty big enough." "If you know part of my story, then you know I can't." She reached over to the light by the bedside, which was the only source of light in the room, and switched it off. They found themselves plunged into a hard darkness that wouldn't let them see even a foot in front of them. Jasper gave up and settled back down onto the couch and was soon falling asleep again. The sun arrived all too early, and because of the windows of the room faced towards the east, it caught the early sun all too well. Even the curtains couldn't stop it as the sun bleared its way through, shouting at them to get up. And so Jasper woke up, finding himself being shaken awake by Johanna. He got up from the couch, and the two were soon found themselves outside after she got dressed again. They were back down by his car when Johanna came to a stop on the passenger side door. She looked over at him as he opened his door. "Are we heading back to the hospital?" "I don't have anywhere else I have to go, I pretty much, I'm just gonna head back." "I have somewhere I want to go, if you don't mind. It will, I think, help both of us." How will it help us?" "I know of an old historian in the area. Loves to know everything about the state, especially if it is surrounded in mystery. He goes by the name of Von Bohm. And this man, who is named after a tree, how does he help me, you, or us?" "You'll see, but only if you're willing to drive there." Jasper looked at the keys in his hands, and then at her. He held them up. "You're so eager to go? Why don't you drive?" He tossed them, and she caught them with a smile and came around to the driver's side as he jumped into the back seat. She drove smoothly out of the parking lot while Jasper laid out in the back seat. It was comforting back there, and he soon found himself falling asleep thanks to the rhythm of the tires on the smoother road, even though it was a bit hilly. The drive took its time winding through roads heading off to some location. Jasper was only awoken by the slamming of a door, which shook him and had him scrambling out of the back of the car. He found Johanna by the vehicle hood, staring at the house that was seemingly trying to have a mysterious aura to it. Alas, it wasn't very good at this mysterious look, due to the fact that it was painted very brightly and sprightly looking. Jasper figured that the well-kept garden had a thing or two to do with that among the colorful flowers and plants that just chased away the mysterious aura that seemed to lurk in the windows. This is the place you are talking about. No, this is their house. Thanks. I figured that out, and you know what I was talking about. She offered a cheeky grin and came away from the vehicle, heading towards the walkway to the house that led to the front door. Then shall we go and see if we can talk to this person already? Of course, she didn't wait for him as she was unhitching the gate that separated the sidewalk from the walkway and was soon heading up it. Jasper followed, surprising himself, as he wasn't exactly sure why he was here or what he was doing. Johanna had already rung the doorbell by the time he joined her on the deck. They waited a few minutes, but there was no response, so Johanna knocked, to which the door swung slightly open, all on its own. Jasper felt a shiver go down his spine and couldn't help but push the door fully open. The bedroom, in front of them, was brightly lit and seemed to be undisturbed. "Hello, Mr. Von Baum." There was no response, and they decided they should step inside. As they stepped inside, they could swear that they heard the sound of shuffling feet coming from nearby. Jasper looked over at Johanna, who looked worried and yet curious. She'd already taken a step beyond the mudroom, and he feared that she was going to charge in to find out what was going on. And that's exactly what she did. She was through the living room area in a flash, with Jasper desperately trying to keep up with her and slow her down. Of what he saw of the place, it looked very nice, but like a place that one didn't go charging about into or around. There was at least one ornamental-looking shotgun hanging from the wall, and some very fine-looking vases that wanted to look like they would teeter over at the slightest big, heavy footstep. But the gun was what drew his attention the most, as usually when there was one gun, there were others, and usually the owners knew how to use them. The next room he found himself in was a kitchen, which Jasper barely got to see, though it felt entirely different from the living room which they'd just been in. It was old, with an ancient stove or something like that, as they followed the strengthening noise of voices, and there was no longer any shuffling of footsteps. A glass door led to the greenhouse conservatory-like space, which they entered. The sound of surprise came from the tangle of plants that blocked their view. The rattling of the door alerted whoever was inside to the people coming. Jasper had finally caught up to Johanna and slowed her down as they followed the pathway that cuts its way through the greenhouse. Finally, they came upon a man who was next to a table, looking around wildly. When he spotted the duo, he stopped and stared. "Oh, I should have known. Dr. Von Baum, what is going on here?" "I was having a very nice meeting, and you scared away the person who was here. Now, Miss Locke, your father told me all about you, and that I shouldn't tell you anything about what's going on at Madhouse. Why?" "I don't know. He doesn't want me to discover something about the hospital or the island." Baum turned and glanced over at Jasper, who stood somewhat awkwardly behind her. "And who are you?" Jasper Hughes, worker at the hospital." "And why are you two here? Well, why are you here, Mr. Hughes?" "Well, I was brought by Miss Locke, who decided you had answers about the strangeness that was going on there." "I see. Come with me." The man looked elderly. He moved with a crisp walk that said he wasn't letting age get to him as he passed them by in a second. He took them to his study, a place filled with books, a bit of dust here and there, and a great desk which dominated the area it stood in. Baum sunk into his comfy leather chair, which was the only one in the room, and looked over at them. "The island is not haunted or anything of that nature. This is why your father didn't want me to tell you anything, as he knows your nature of exploring and overthinking about things. It does have some odd things that have happened, like the disappearance of the two people and of the patients, but other than that, there's really nothing there. It's a rather boring place." "That's your belief? That all the scratching noise and disappearances are nothing but a coincidence?" "That is just an awfully easy answer." The words drew a sharp look from Baum, who seemed curious, but then his eyes went back to the dull look that they'd had. There was something being hidden, and Jasper wondered if Johanna had seen it. A glance over at him told him that she was deep in thought as she cast her glance downward, studying the floor for answers. "All this is made up by people trying to get attention, or who are trying to make money off of the mystery, like those two that published a book on the matter. It was a pure money grab, I think." Doing his best to control his seething frustration, Jasper turned away from the man and touched Johanna's arm. "I think we should leave now." She snapped out of her thoughts and looked about, confused. What?" He leaned in closer to whisper. "We need to go. Mr. Baum is hiding things and doesn't actually want to talk to you." He gently pulled at her arm as he headed for the door. As gently as he could, Jasper continued to pull Johanna out of the house as she seemed rather lost and confused. The visit had not gone to her plans as far as he could tell, and this had upset her. The rush of fresh air seemed to bring her back around a bit as they approached his car, and she went automatically to the driver's side and got in. Jasper went to the passenger side and turned to see Baum staring at them harshly from his deck. The man's arms were folded behind him as he glared. There was a coldness to this man that shouldn't be there, and yet there it was. Jasper shook his head as he got in and the car got going. Finally, when they'd gotten away from the house, Johanna managed to come back to life as they drove the twisted roads back towards the lake. She still looked a bit lost and confused, but her eyes had returned to their usual brightness. "Apologies for pulling you out of there, by the way. Oh, it's fine. I got ahead of myself as usual, and I figured I could solve what everyone was keeping from me in a simple snap of the fingers. I never learn and always get excited by mysteries." "Well, there certainly is a mystery with that hospital, and now with Baum." "Yes, why wouldn't he be willing to talk? He's probably like a treasure hunter. He doesn't want his share of the secrets known because he can't claim it all for himself." They passed the sign signaling that they were entering the lakeside town of Colchester, and fell into silence as they went. They soon drove through the town to get to the ferry dock, where a large sign posting with times announcing when the ferry would depart for the island. The last time read 5:15, to which Jasper glanced at his car's clock inside. 4:45. So there was hope that they could cross, if the ferry workers decided not to call it an early day. The ferry was already at the dock, so Johanna drove up to the gate that blocked anyone from just driving onto the barge, and got out of the car to get them out so that she could see if the captain of the boat was anywhere around. Jasper, on the other hand, remained in his car, waiting and looking for anything out of the ordinary. The last thing he wanted was the ghost-like figure suddenly popping up in the back and trying to talk to him. The apparition was definitely Port, or at the very least looked exactly like him, which was unnerving and forced him to continually look around. Thankfully, nothing popped up, and Johanna was soon back with the barge captain who let them all into the boat. As they departed, A fog crept its way across the lake, plunging them into it. It was soon wrapped around the vessel, which was continued plodding along as if it wasn't the least bit bothered by the fact that they couldn't see. The only real changes that the captain made were to turn on the forward front lights, illuminating the front bow, and to occasionally give a blast of his horn to warn any other boats out on the water that they were there. What sun was left hanging behind the clouds had dipped low enough to not be of much help in seeing as the fog thickened. The barge, however, ignored all of this as it gently bumped its way into the dock and came to a stop on the island. Once everything was at a stop, the captain came strolling down from his wheelhouse perch and stopped by their car, knocking on the driver's side window. Johanna obligingly rolled it down with a crank. "Hello, if you don't mind, I need a lift into town. The fog is getting a bit much to be driving around the old barge in." Johanna looked over at Jasper, who shrugged. "Well, it is the least we can do for you, I guess." The captain nodded his appreciation and then moved forward to open the gate for the boat and then the one to the landing area that would allow them to drive off. Once clear, they did exactly this, and then came to a stop as they waited for the captain to redo everything up, and then hop into the back seat. Johanna then quietly put the car back into gear, and was driving, and found herself driving through the swirling fog, keeping the lights on low as they traversed the island's twisted roads. The bumpiness of the road jostled them about as the ride was not a very comfortable one, because of the slow going as the fog crept all over the place, making each bump and pothole that much worse. A short while later, they managed to stop on the main road through the little town on the island. The captain jumped out of the car, and giving a salute as thanks, he too soon disappeared into this fog, and was gone. With that done, the two then set off, heading slowly for the hospital. It had been a very quiet ride from the dock to the back parking lot of the hospital, where Jasper had originally parked his car. The two were sitting in silence even after Johanna had brought the car to a stop in a parking space in this back parking lot. They sort of sat there and stared at the building in front of them, as much as they could see of it, as some lights were illuminating the offices where workers were busy with something. "So, what's the story we tell to people?" "That you wanted to get away, and I tagged along because I wanted to make sure that you were okay." "And what if your dad begins asking questions?" "I will think of something for him to keep him busy." She reached for the door handle and popped the door open. Jasper remained seated, thinking that that might be an alright answer for her to say that, but he was definitely going to get called in by the big boss at some point, demanding answers of why he was going around somewhere with his daughter. And so he got out of his car and began the trek back to the dorms. Jasper had managed to make his way back up to his quarters and was almost at the door to his place that had been given to him. He heard angry footsteps coming up behind him, but he decided he did not want to know who it was and why they were hurrying towards him, so he rushed towards his door, trying to get his keys out to unlock it. However, as he got the key into the door, the footsteps caught up to him. "Mr. Hughes, you have been absent." "No, I have not, Miss Elise." He turned to look over at her. She was red and angry looking. "Mr. Reginald told me that I have Wednesdays and Thursdays off from work, so I left to collect myself, get adjusted. You know, the usual." "I know that you were with that wretched psychologist, Locke, weren't you? She meddles into everyone's business pretending to be friends and saying things about adventure, or an adventure. Also something about finding out about this place's history. It's a bunch of bull, if you'll pardon my language." "You're pardoned. Now, if you will excuse me." He'd gotten the door open and was stepping through. She, however, followed him as best she could. Trying his best to be polite for once when he was inside the room, he didn't try and shut the door in her face. He waited for her to explain herself and all of her obstinance that she was displaying. "You're mine to figure out, and not hers." "Who is whose? And why am I being fought over?" "You're mine because there's a mystery to you, and I love a good mystery." She was now staring at him, trying to look sultry, and, well, sort of got there, but it didn't do anything for him. She was a nice person, but this whole thing was far too much for his mind to take in. No, thank you to any of that. Now, I still have a lot of unpacking to do, so I shall say goodbye here." He moved the door to try and close it, and she, for whatever reason, moved out of the way, letting it shut. He emerged from his room the next afternoon, carefully. Jasper did not want to run into Elise, or really anyone else. It was all a bit much. And when she didn't pop up, he breathed a sigh of relief, and headed towards the hidden cafeteria. His thoughts were still a jumbled mess from the past few days. Nothing about this place was making sense anymore, let alone why he was there when the man he was supposed to be following, or keeping an eye on, wasn't there. But still, he needed some food this late afternoon, and, well, he needed food. He'd gotten to the hidden cafeteria and settled in at a table for a quick breakfast that was really a dinner before he got to work. Jasper looked around the place. It was mostly empty aside from a few workers, and those seemingly busy gossiping about some prison break not far away. "They say that at least 2 men have broken out of jail and are headed this way. To the island? With our history? I mean, it seems like a great place to hide out, but you'd have to swim here because surely the ferry will shut down. It's all a bunch of nonsense meant to scare people. Prison breaks don't happen these days." "Okay, so when you're murdered by this notorious mass murderer, Lacey Tennessee, don't come crying to me." "I would have a hard time coming crying to you if it did happen." Jasper decided it was best to tune out of the rest of this conversation, the only interesting part being that the island would be mostly shut off from the rest of civilization should there be a prison break. Though, with the way this place had made him feel the first few days of working here, it wouldn't be much different from the usual. They were very separated from the world. Bored already of hearing this small talk, he quickly finished his food and headed out. After a while, Jasper found himself working back in the patient and introductory building, cleaning floors and rooms while minding his own business during his shift. Elise had not appeared at any time during his shift, and Vera, who he had wanted to run into, wasn't around either. He worked the first floor of the building, cleaning what needed to be done, and just working his shift away. This was all under the supervision of one Orkney, one of the doctors assigned to the building, who had strict beliefs in cleanliness. So much so that Jasper wondered if the man wouldn't be better suited for his job instead. But the shift went by uneventfully, and it was soon almost over before Orkney even let him take a break in a nearby break room, a place that was empty of anything aside from some vegetables and fruits on a nearby table. Plus a timid little water fountain, one that only allowed a bit of water out with a press of a button and then would cut off. It was all very depressing, and there was no one else there. So he sat at the small table, waiting for something to happen, anything to happen, as he was bored. This job was not going to plan, and the man he'd come for wasn't here, a thought that kept ringing through his mind. Finally, just as his break was about up, and he'd gotten to the doorway of the break room, Dr. Bunder appeared and brushed past him with a rather dark look. "Oh, Dr. Bunder, sir. Good to see you. Is it Mr. Hughes? Is it good to see me, or is it terrible?" I'm sorry, is something wrong?" "Just hearing stories about my fiancé traveling off with a stranger to visit the town of Colchester. That's my problem." "Oh, well, that is a problem for you. If you wish to talk about it, I'm certainly willing to listen, but I have no need to defend myself against any attacks. But, nothing happened." But the doctor just looked at him darkly and did not seem pleased. So Jasper exited the break room. With his shift done, Jasper had returned to the maintenance office to clock out for the day, and as he was entering the office to do so, he ran fully into Vera, who was coming out. "Oh, I'm sorry." "Oh, no, it was an accident." She looked surprised to see that it was him, and looked him over carefully. "Ah, Miss Vera, I've been looking for you." You have?" Yes, I needed to talk to you, or well, Miss Locke probably wants to talk to you about your book." Her face darkened at the suggestion that, and she walked off. He was torn for a second about what to do, but figured that Locke could also find this woman if she wanted to talk to her. He, on the other hand, was too tired to deal with such matters, and headed into the office to clock out. The trip back to the living quarters was a short tram ride that dropped him off in the basement. To his surprise, there were quite a few people waiting around for a ride, and they all seemed to be jovially talking to one another, and more gossiping was going on. "I heard about this racy-looking set of lingerie that will set your boyfriend afire with jealousy and envy in this magazine." "That sounds perfect. I need help getting his attention." Why he'd picked up this conversation to hear was beyond him as he walked past. "I'd be careful. Rumors of murder on the loose, and that nosy reporter are around again." "The one that wrote the book about the island? Oh, that was simply the worst book ever written. It went on and on about ghosts and creatures without a single shred of evidence." "You read it? I heard that Locke had banned the book from being around here." "No, not here, of course. I would never read it here. I didn't want to catch Locke's anger. No, I was safely away from here so that I wouldn't get caught. Not that it was worth the time and effort. No, it was a bunch of gibberish, really." Jasper was curious about Chris, the man who'd called him in the diner, though he wasn't sure if that was the man's name or not, or if that was who they were referring to, as it all felt too neat and too connected. Things never came in tidy packages without some terrible cost. And so he made his way up towards his room. The sound of an alarm blaring awoke Jasper from his sleep, with his first thought being it was too early for his alarm to be going off. The second thought was that it wasn't his alarm going off, but something much louder and obnoxious. He wondered if it was a fire alarm as he rolled out of his bed, but there didn't appear to be one of those in his room, and there was no annoying flashing light to blind him. He got out of his bed and walked towards the door. Blearily, he stepped out of his room and looked about. Everyone else seemed rather bothered by all of this, and were looking rather confused. "Ladies and gentlemen of the workers' house, we need you to exit the building in an orderly fashion. A situation has come up, and we want you on the front lawn." The announcement was repeated a few times as everyone got moving towards the exits. They found themselves shepherded outside and stood in disorganized bunches on the front lawn. Jasper was not yet fully awake, but enjoyed the early afternoon sun as he walked about. "Please line up in orderly rows." He looked over to see a security guard standing near the front door with a bullhorn and a very vicious-looking nightstick. There was much grumbling as people tried to figure out where the voice was coming from, and then all eyes settled on the man up front standing there with that bullhorn. Not that he needed it. The group of employees soon had a loose formation of lines and rows formed up. "First row, meaning the first people on the line closest to me, should turn to the right. Once this turn to the right is completed, you will march down to the medical building and enter the front door. As for the rest of you, once the last person in the row in front of you has passed your line, you will follow by turning right and following that last person. That is all." This, for whatever reason, quickly got underway, and Jasper, who had found himself in the third line, was soon turned and marching his way along. The pathway road from the sleeping quarters to the medical building did not take very long, and in that time Jasper had woken up and was severely wondering what was going on as he went up the front stairs of the medical building and inside. He found himself standing in a hallway, still in the line with others, but they had been moved through the building, all so that they could stand near medical examination rooms. Every once in a while a door would open, and a person at the head of the line would go to that door. Everything was moving at a breakneck speed, with doors opening and people disappearing into them, never to be seen again. Jasper felt a sinking feeling in his stomach as the line kept moving, and he counted 6 doors as he passed them by. Of course, it was soon his turn, and he approached slowly, whereas everyone else seemingly didn't seem bothered by this situation. The door to his right, the 6th door, opened, and he marched over towards it, and then slowed as he stepped inside. The examination room looked like any other found in a doctor's office. It was clean, had lots of cabinets for holding office supplies or medical supplies, and there was also 2 chairs and, of course, the examination bed. He stepped further in to see a doctor idly sitting on a chair, smoking a cigarette, signing something on a clipboard. "Sit on the table." Jasper moved over to the examination table to sit down, his mind still trying to put 2 and 2 together. "Name and occupation at the facility." "Jasper Hughes. Maintenance? The doctor shot up from his chair, stethoscope in hand, and was soon checking over Jasper. They went through the usual routine of a checkup. Then the doctor sat back down and wrote something down on his clipboard. Can I ask what's going on?" "Checkup. Staff checkup to make sure that everyone is performing at their best." The doctor then ripped a piece of paper from his clipboard and handed it over, then pointed towards the door that had an exit sign above it, behind him. "Go through the door and join the next line, handing them this when asked for it by staff overseeing this checkup. Do not give it to any of the regular staff. Thank you." Jasper took the piece of paper and looked rather puzzled by all of this. Nothing that was going on here made any sense anymore, and he desperately wanted out, but there was nowhere else to go, and so he headed for the door that was indicated. He was confused when he found himself in another hallway, and once again in another line, though this line didn't appear to be waiting for anything as they moved towards the end of the hallway. Everywhere that Jasper looked, people had little pieces of paper that were in their hands, and they all seemed to be safeguarding. So he, too, took to protecting his paper as he was rushed to the end of the hall. This hurried movement led him to an atrium of a medical building in the next area, where more staff were standing and looking at the pieces of paper that were handed over. Then they were handed a new piece of paper to also hold on to, as well as their old paper back, and Jasper went along with this as well, and finally glanced down at his 2 pieces of paper as he was directed towards the right side of the room. On one was his name and the word "suitable" written on it. The other had the color red and the number 17 on it. This, he felt, only added to what was probably a headache that felt like it was coming on harshly. Jasper looked about one last time at the atrium, noting that the line was being split up, with people going to the right and the left. Then a slight push from the person behind him sent him into the next room. A massive gym greeted him in this next area, to which Jasper looked about the space for the nearest exit. This was all too much, and roundabout for a physical that should have been done by one person. However, the exits off to the sides of this place were guarded by guards, and the only way out of this was to go forward, where in front of him was a table with more people who took both pieces of paper, looked at them, and then directed them to another area. What this served as a purpose, he didn't know. But when he got to the front of the line and handed over his papers, he stood firmly in spot, even as they were handed back to him. "What's going on?" "Checkups." "This isn't a checkup. It's being run through a maze like a rat or a mouse or something. It has me moving from space to space without an actual medical checkup." We need to split you into groups to best deal with medical concerns. Now please take this before the guards come over here and take both of us away." Jasper decided he didn't want to budge, but his attention was drawn and he looked over at a guard who was coming near from one of the doors and was moving slowly towards him. A push from the person behind him got him moving again and finally put Jasper in motion as he grabbed his papers and headed for the door just so that he would not be beaten up by this guard, who had a rather nasty-looking club swinging about in his hands. After all of this, Jasper found himself standing outside, taking in the fresh air as people were directed towards school buses that had been parked behind the medical building on the walkway. Here it didn't seem to matter what the papers had said, as he was pointed towards a nearby bus in a crush of many, many employees, and he could only follow where he was being pointed towards. This bus was crowded with passengers, and Jasper was hurried towards the back to find a seat. He found himself seated next to a rather downcast-looking woman. The pleather-like substance that made up the covering of the seat kept him sliding as he tried to get comfortable in it. Hi, are you okay?" She looked over at him with sad eyes. "It's all over. I'm going to lose my job." Why? "A worker. Someone amongst us got under the skin of the director, Mr. Locke." The bus engine roared to life as the squeaky door was swung shut in front. The bench seat, which seemed loosely bolted to the floor of the bus, vibrated as the engine shook the floor. Then, as the engine settled down, so did the vibrations. What exactly did this person do? And how can Mr. Dr. Locke have so much power here? If I knew that and who exactly it was, I would have ratted them out so we could avoid this mess. Now I'm going to be out of a job because of a bad paper. Jasper glanced over at the paper that she held up with an unfit written on it, but his had suitable written on it. If they were separating those that were good and bad, then why was she here? Or why had he been put here? The line of buses drove away from the hospital, quickly covering the ground as they headed away. The only thing Jasper could tell was that they were getting closer to town, as the woman, who was at the window seat, crowded out the view so he couldn't really tell. The trip came to a quick and surprising end as their bus came to a stop in the middle of town. Other buses kept driving past, but theirs came to a stop, and the door was flipped open once again. The group were soon on their feet and were being shuffled off of the bus. This, Jasper felt like, was just another way to confuse the whole matter. They were being paraded about for some nefarious reason, instead of just firing employees. Why they had made up this complex process to distort what was going on, he couldn't say. At least that's the opinion he came to at this time as he reached the door. Once out of the bus, however, things went chaotic. The papers were grabbed out of his hand. The group, which had been so calm a second ago, was now rushing about, and he soon found himself rushing with them, because he was being pushed and prodded every which way. Once he got his senses about, he began to head for a nearby building that seemed like a great place to hide out and just clear his mind of what was going on. It looked like a courthouse of some sort, and he was making a beeline straight for it. However, something grabbed him and pulled him off towards the side of an alleyway. The hand let go as it pulled him into the nearby alleyway, and Jasper, was lost and confused mind, was still trying to deal with all that was going on. He was staring back out of the alleyway to see what was happening and why everyone was suddenly rushing about. A bit of smoke came into view. "Jasper, pay attention." Jasper turned and looked at the man who had dragged him over here. He was greeted by the sight of his uncle Edgar Port, and in the distance, Johanna Locke getting out of a running car. End of part 3. Thank you for listening.